So it's good to see that everybody's here. So yeah, we're going to talk about malware persistence. Anybody here do malware analysis or have to deal with ransomware or anything like that? Yeah. So you're probably familiar with the concept of persistence. So for me, that's a big picture. I lead Grant Thornton Cybersecurity Services in Canada. So I've been in the industry for about 25 years. I'm out of Halifax. So I was trying to get as far away from the aftermath of the hurricane as possible. I came out here. So no, I was actually here to do some work and figured I'd come out and attend B-Sides, and I noticed they were looking for speakers, so I put my name in, and hey, lo and behold, I'm a speaker. So I do speak at a lot of different events, Black Hat, DEF CON, those kind of conferences, and on various subjects. My expertise is more in the critical infrastructure space, so operational technology and that kind of thing. So persistence. So if you're familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, it is one of the specific techniques that comes out. I'm not going to read the definition, but essentially, at the end of the day, it's about adversaries making sure that they can maintain a foothold in your environment. And specifically, what we'll talk about today is persistence within malware. So once malware gets deployed on a machine or in an environment, what does a malware developer need to do to make sure that that malware stays resident for as long as possible? So in the Windows world, and I'm going to focus mainly on Windows. I know this exists in other environments and other operating systems, but because we only have 50 minutes, I'm going to focus on Windows. Persistence is not a bad thing. Persistence is something that is built into the Windows operating system because there's good uses for it. And those uses there are referred to as auto-start extensibility points, or ASEPs. There's a lot of reasons we may have ASEPs in our Windows environment. Things like, who here runs Slack, for example? So you want Slack to kind of be persistent, right? You don't want it to go away and then you miss messages. You might have something like really annoying Cortana. Who loves Cortana? I don't know. When I'm installing Windows for the first time, it's like, how can I help you? By turning you up. Or I run tools like Snagit, for example. If you want to do screenshots, that stuff, you don't want it to go away after the first time. So there are legitimate reasons to having ASEPs in your environment. Now, Windows is built around this concept, and of course, anytime you build something, somebody's going to take advantage of it, and that's why we have persistence with malware. So from the adversary's perspective, there's real reasons they're going to do this. Real-time mechanisms, it takes time to reach their goals. So in a lot of in cases that we have malware that gets deployed, this is not something that's going to take 5 minutes for them to reach the goals that they're trying to reach. It's going to go on for a period of time, so there has to be persistence, right? They have to be able to survive a reboot. So this isn't always likelihood, in likelihood case that it's going to happen. It doesn't always work out this way, but that's the premise that we're fighting for. So at the end of the day, I reboot my machine, that malware that got deployed, I don't want it to not go, I want to go away. I want it to come back on the reboot, right? And then obviously, things like different tools, different techniques. And then from a post-incident perspective, it's things like reestablishing access or maintaining data collection. So things like backdoors that are built into malware, we want those backdoors to come back, and we want them to be there so that when the attacker needs to get back on that machine to do whatever he's doing, there is some way of doing that at the end of the day. So how does that work? Well, I'm going to go through the various areas within the Windows operating system where there are methods that attackers will use when they build malware to persist. The first one and the most notable one is the good old registry. So here, I'm assuming everybody knows what the registry is. Everybody's been into regedit and they've whacked away at some stuff and totally messed up a computer one time in their life. Well, the registry is essentially a database of all of your settings, options, values, has basically an asset list of all the software you have installed. So anytime that you install something, all of those settings, they get stored in the registry. So, and this is a persistent thing across all versions of Windows. So, going back to previous versions of Windows, they've all had some form of a registry at one point. So when a program is installed, for example, it's going to install a new subkey in the registry, and that subkey is going to have those settings with regards to the program. So it could be things like where you've installed the program in Windows, the version, and could be all kinds of other settings that are associated with that specific program. So here, for example, you can see installing the Brave browser. You can see it, the actual location of where the installer is. Now, there are places, and again, when you look at this, think of the legitimate reasons why you would have this, but there's also obviously the illegitimate reasons why you would have this. So, for example, we have the keys of run and run once. Anybody familiar with this?
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, if you've been in this industry as long as I have, you've gone in and you've tried to make things work over years. You've like, hey, maybe I can get it to do this if I go and whack away at that registry key. So your run and run once keys are there to basically cause programs to run each time a user logs in. So the run executes every time a user logs in, and run once clears the registry key as soon as the command is run. So you can see here the two examples of where they sit in the actual registry. And then will go, and when he's deploying his malware, he's going to go and write some registry keys to make sure that that program will run when the user logs in. If you're familiar with WannaCrypt, so WannaCrypt used this type of persistence. So essentially, in the run basically in the run as part of the HKey current user and HKey local machine keys, it basically was starting this task scheduler or fake task scheduler, so that basically this would persist every time the person would log into the machine. Another area that we see in the registry is the boot execute key. So part of Windows, there's a component called the Session Manager Subsystem, or SMSS. This executes during the startup process. It sets a whole bunch of things within Windows, things like your environment variables. It starts your kernel and user modes. It creates that page file, so when your machine has to swap off of your memory, that page file is created. It starts the Windows Login Manager. So it's that initial system that gets everything in Windows spinning initially. So the SMSS launches before the Windows subsystem loads, and it calls a specific configuration subsystem to load the hive present at that location, or that hive list. It also will launch anything present in the boot execute key. So what ends up happening is we can go and we can modify that. So if you go into Windows today and you go and look at that specific key, that boot execute key in the current control set 001 control session manager, it should have that value in there. Auto check asterisk. I can 100% say that that's what's going to be in there. So what malware developers like to do is they like to add something onto the end of that. So when Windows is loading up those initial components to be able to get Windows running, creating the page file, getting everything set up, it's also going to go in and it's going to launch whatever's in that key. So again, it's a place where you can hide the location and the path and the actual executable that you want to launch in a very scary place here, because it's so much in the initial start of Windows that, for example, if you have an EDR tool or an antivirus, in a lot of cases it'll miss that, because it starts up before those services actually launch in Windows. So there's some very scary things that they do here to be able to bypass your EDR or your antivirus or what have you, your security tools, because they're starting up so early in the boot process, at the kernel loading process stage, right? Another one we see is this concept of the WinLogger helper DLL. So there's a key called the user init key. So again, Windows WinLogin process uses the value specified in the user init key to launch login scripts. And that's at this location. So current version Win login. So this points to userinit.exe, but if this key is altered, then the exe will also launch during the win login process. So for example, you can see here we have that userinit key. What the attacker could do is basically add on something to this value, again, during that win login process to actually launch their malware as well. So it looks something like this. So you can see here I have my typical usernit, which points to my usernit.exe, but I'm concatenating command.exe on the end of it. So when that login process happens, not only does the usernit run, but it also runs my malware in the background. And again, all of these things happen so early in the Windows process that, again, they're, in a lot of cases, are really hard to capture by a lot of the vendors out there. We have the notify key, very similar to the previous one. So this is part of the SAS process, or when you do the control-alt-delete. So when you do the control-alt-delete, you can actually add, very similar, you can add an exe on the end of that. So these are used to notify event handles when the SAS happens and loads a DLL. The DLL that's loaded can be edited to launch whatever you want at that control-alt-delete process, right? Another interesting one is our good old explorer.exe. So essentially that points to your current version WinLogin shell, and that points to your explorer.exe or your actual Windows subsystem, your Windows interface, right? The only thing in there that should be in there is the explorer.exe. And again, malware developers like to use this key to add on extra bits to it to be able to launch things, as well as the explorer.exe. So a good example of that, if you're familiar with Gazer, which is a backdoor piece of malware. So essentially what Gazer was doing is it was establishing persistence by setting the shell value in explorer.exe with basically its malware path. So you can see on the example there, we have our explorer.exe, and then I'm actually injecting that ntuser.dat.log3 file into Explorer when it terminates. So there's a lot of things here that, and again, unless, I'm going to show you some ways of doing this, but unless you're actually looking at changes in the registry, you're never going to know this is happening. There's nothing in Windows that I'll actually come back and say, uh-oh, you made a change to the registry. And what is the biggest thing, the biggest issue with the registry? Can anybody tell me that?
It's centralized.
Close? It's huge, but it's not forgiving. Like if you go into the registry and you change something and you close the registry, there's no like, do you really want to do that? Do you really want to do that? And if you remove something from the registry, it's like, you know when you're in Linux and everything's loaded up and you can start to just delete stuff and you're not going to know that it's bad until you've rebooted the machine? That's the registry. You can smack away stuff in the registry and then you go reboot your machine and then it just doesn't work. So the registry is a very scary place, and that's why, you know, from the perspective of this, there's lots that can be done in it. We have our good old startup keys. So these are very typical with malware developers. So being able to start things up on boot up. So you can see those startup keys here. We have them, your common programs, your common start menu, your common startup and templates. All those things can be modified to launch or persist malware as well. So here's a good example of a registry addition. You can see here that by running this registry addition, we can actually add things like, here we have a launcher.link file, so we can actually point to a link file and basically launch an application that way. And that's on startup through the startup keys. We have the startup folder itself. So this is kind of old school, you know, and most people don't use this anymore. If you're as old as I am, you would have used it back in the Windows 3.1 95 days. You know, when you wanted to load up a program every time, you're like, that really stupid screensaver you downloaded through your modem, you would add it to the startup folder. Well, it's still there, and you can still use it. So it's in the app data roaming Microsoft Windows Start menu program startup folder. you can copy things in there and they will load up. Now they load up later in the boot process, so there is a good chance they'll be picked up by your EDR, but it is still there, and it is still a relatively easy thing that you can use to persist malware. The important note is that anything that gets executed will be under the context of the user logging in. So again, it's going to be based on the privileges of the user that's logging into the machine. So you could have stuff that's launching in that startup folder because it's in that roaming directory. That won't run because it needs to have privileged access. But there is, of course, there is a system-wide startup folder in the program data directory. And then essentially anything that's put in there, when it loads into the system, no matter where they are, it's going to be basically executed with that privileged level. So there are a bunch of places they can be basically putting this at any given time. So here's an example. I've got a launcher shortcut here that is sitting in that program's startup directory. Another good place we can actually persist our malware. Does anybody have any questions so far? Yeah.
The first one that you showed that loaded early.
Yeah.
When you've got app locker,
Mm-hmm.
is that loaded before that hits, or does that load before the app locker service?
After.
Loads after.
Same thing with if you're running like Carbon Black, if you're running like a whitelisting solution, it's after.
That key runs after Carbon Black and stuff load?
No, it runs before that, before those tools run.
So you're still screwed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And I'm going to show you, what I'm going to show you afterwards is some non-commercial free ways of actually doing this. There are ways to basically start to log certain things to look for these things, and I'll show you how to do that. I apologize, I've had like 12 cups of coffee because I'm still on Halifax time, and I was up, like my wife called me at 4 o'clock this morning, and she's like, "Oh yeah, you're in Calgary, you were asleep." Like, thank you. Yeah, do you know where those cans of soup are? Like, no. And then she's like, "Oh, go back to bed." Then 4:30 she calls me, "I found them." Like drinking coffee to kind of get myself going, right? So I apologize if I'm a little jittery, right? So Gazer again used link files. So what Gazer basically did was command this /q parameter. If you're a DOS person, you remember the command parameters. So it would turn off echo, so you wouldn't see anything come back, and then it would essentially execute the command. So this was another common way that Gazer was using to establish its persistence. Services. We all like the services, right? So this is another area. So again, your services are all controlled through the registry. The registry can be written, and it's very easy to write, and it'll allow you to do anything in there. So again, attackers are going to go through the registry to get to your services. So for example, in the registry, there's two areas where you're going to see your services: run services once and run services, as well as your main part of the hive, which is where your actual list of services are. So everything, you know, when you go into your Microsoft Services applet and you see all the services listed, and then it has information like whether it's going to run automatically or manually, all that's stored in the registry. So you can make changes galore to your services without actually going in the services applet, right? So think in your mind what a malware person can do with this, right? So here's a really interesting one. Did you guys know this existed? So there is this really cool place that if a service fails, you can actually tell it what to do if that service fails, and you have a bunch of different options. So for example, you have a first failure, a second failure, and subsequent failures. So a lot of people don't know this exists, but let's say you have a program running and that service running, and that service goes to start and it fails. You can tell Windows what to do if it fails. Now, in most cases, nothing's really going to happen, but in some cases, you can have it do things. And if you basically tell it to run a program, you can put that program right in that little browser when you can go to find your exe and you can save it. Now, what do you think a malware person's going to do with this, right? So here's a good example. So at the top, I have the first way that malware developers use is a registry key, because this is all stored in the registry, right? So you do a reg add, HT local machine system, current control set, services, and I'm using the fax. Everybody uses fax, right? It's still there in Windows. It's still a service, the fax service. So I have the service /v failure command, okay? /t reg, I'm going to add my key, and I'm going to point it to temp backdoor, okay? So you can see my little command prompt. I just ran a regular command line reg add, right? Operation completed successfully. And then when I look at my registry, you can see right, I have a pointer, yes. You can see right there, there's my failure command, ctemp backdoor DXE. So what you do is you go in, when you're building your malware, you figure a way to kill the fax service. And when the fax service dies, my backdoor opens. So all you have to do is look for, and that's when you have to kind of think about these things, you know, in the life cycle of things. When you see those vulnerabilities and they say, oh, you know, vulnerability of this service, and if you do this, it's going to cause the service to die. And you're like, oh, well, it's never going to happen to me. Well, the malware guy is going to look at that. He's going to find that vulnerability. He's going to use that vulnerability as the starting process to kill it so that he can get his persistence. So you got to think of it that way. The other way you can do this is through a regular service control command at the command line again. So if I do a service control failure fax and I pass the command, it doesn't work very well. You can see on the right-hand side there, my program is now C Windows System 32 backdoor.exe. Excuse me, in the corresponding registry setting, there's my failure command of backdoor.exe. So again, playing around with services, this is another way that we can actually get persistence.
So this is actually turning a denial of service attack into a remote code execution attack by setting that
Pretty
up.
much. So think of it, you're on your machine and like some, you know, and you're looking at the crazy event logs, because everybody looks at those and you can glean everything from that, right? So you look at the event logs and it's like service failed for no unknown reason because it doesn't tell you. And you're like, oh, well, I guess I don't need the fax service today. Meanwhile, something else is running in the background, right? Your file association keys, so this is an interesting one as well. Basically taking your, associating your file types to something else, okay? So that can be done in the registry, right? So here's a good example. I have the file association for txt file. So a .txt, what would you default that to? Notepad, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add a value in there, so when you open that notepad, something's going to happen. So here's a good example of that, right? I basically associated notepad, still going to be notepad that's going to open, but I'm also going to open netcat in the background. So essentially, you double click on any txt file, and my notepad opens, and then my backdoor starts up in the background running netcat. Now I know obviously netcat's a bad example because any antivirus tool today should pick that up, but you can see how easy it is to reassociate a file type and actually launch something in the background. And the great thing about it is, now this is very visible because you actually see the netcat process in the background, but because Notepad starts up, nobody knows that anything bad's happening. Like, oh, Notepad, okay, yeah, that's what I expected. So if you have the expectation and that works, well, then at the end of the day, they don't know anything's happening in the background. Anybody heard of the term the term DLL sideloading? This is a really cool one too. So, so everybody knows what a DLL is, right? Everybody knows that a DLL is very close to an exe file. It's just not executable. So your DLL is basically your libraries that your EXEs are going to use, right? So all the things that an EXE does, open a window, close a window, make a window look like this, put a pointer here, a pointer there, open a network connection. All those things are functions that are stored in the DLL. And we do that so that basically our EXEs are not like 600 gigs in size. And because a lot of these processes, these functions are shared across all these different EXEs, there's no point in having them all buried into an EXE, right? So what we can do is we can play around with this. because the DLLs are there, we can actually play around and say, well, what if instead of opening the DLL that you're supposed to open, you open the DLL that I put on there, right? So when you go to open a Windows program, Windows actually goes through a list of common places to look for a DLL. So for example, if you're going to open a program and that program is going to look for a specific function, it's going to go through a bunch of places in Windows looking for that DLL. So for example, it's going to look in the directory where the application was launched. Okay, so if it's a custom built application and it has some custom DLLs, they're going to probably be in the directory where the exe is. So the first thing it's going to do is going to say, okay, does that DLL with that function exist in this directory? No, it doesn't. So the next place it's going to go is going to go to your Windows System 32 directory. It's going to do the same thing. It's going to say, does that DLL here with that function? No. It's going to go to the Windows directory, then the current working directory, then the directories you have defined in your path variable that you set up in Windows. Now, because this order does not change, we can actually go and find out where the best place to inject our DLL would be. So if we know, for example, that we are going to sideload to Microsoft Word, we know the DLLs because we can use tools to figure this out. We know what DLLs it's going to use, and we know where they are. So as long as we put our malicious DLL in the place prior to where the real DLL is, it's going to open ours before it opens the real one. And we can have all kinds of really good stuff in there. We can have the functions it's looking for, so it's legitimate, but we can also have some other good things in there to maintain persistence. So for example, the really interesting thing that Microsoft came out with is they said, well, hang on, we know security. We're going to go and protect Windows against this. So we're going to create this thing called Safe DLL Search Mode. Okay? So if this is enabled in Windows, then the OS is going to check whether the DLL is already loaded in memory, or if it's part of the known DLL registry key located in this known DLL key in the registry. Again, what is the registry? It's a list of stuff that we can change. So we can just go and modify that known DLLs key, and we can go basically add our malicious DLL to that list prior to doing what we're going to do. So there you go, Microsoft. We've foiled you again. We have shortcut hijacking, which is another good one. So that's basically going and taking a shortcut, say to a website. Someone creates a shortcut. We can go and change that. So essentially, what happens is when Firefox or Chrome loads, it's actually going to load an evil website that's going to go download something, and it's going to basically get installed for persistence reasons. So this is another one we can do to install backdoors. Good old APT29 or Cozy Bear used a bunch of these techniques. So things like weaponized Windows shortcut that came down in the zip archive. That came down through a shortcut in a browser shortcut that basically launched Cobalt Strike as a backdoor. So a lot of these concepts are being actively used today by nation states and by various nefarious groups out there. Schedule tasks. We always schedule tasks here. Set up a task that's going to run in Windows. It's going to launch an executable. Well, again, that is something we can change as well. We can go into our schedule task lists, and we can basically modify or add in a scheduled task that's going to run. In this case, I've got a PowerShell command, a little bit of encoding, and it looks very hard to understand, and we can get that to run on a regular basis. So as that scheduled task, we can maintain persistence. Another one that we see that's pretty popular is IFEO, or image file execution options. So IFEO, if you're a developer, is a way of basically debugging file execution. So when you're going to launch an exe and something's going on with it, you want to debug it, you can actually go and you can set a debugger function in the registry to that specific exe. So in this current version, image file execution options, I would basically list the name of the executable, and then I would specify the path to the debugger. So when I launch the program, my debugger launches in the background, and I can actually figure out why my program is not working. Now, can anybody figure out what a malware developer would do with this? Well, does a debugger need to be a debugger? No, probably not. So you can see here, I've got my debugger. So this is specifically for taskmanager.exe. It doesn't have to be like some new program. You can debug anything in Windows. So you all know what the task manager is, right? Control-Alt-Delete, look at your tasks. So every time I launch Control-Alt-Delete, it's going to go into the registry. It's going to see Task Manager in the image file execution options registry, and it's going to basically say, I got to launch a debugger. Well, what's my debugger? Well, it happens to be backdoor.exe. So you can see the persistence. You got to think in your mind, like when you're developing malware, you think of all the places that a user is going to go to on a regular basis and how you can kind of attach to that. So if it's something like you think you understand the psychology of a person when they use Windows, oh, well, they click this or they do this regularly or they hit Control-Alt-Delete. All those places, you try to find the most likely place that you can persist your malware, right? So we're all familiar with the SolarWinds sunburst thing. Anybody have any problems with that? No. I feel for you if you did. So I did a lot of incident response for this one. So they use the IFEO debugger registry value for the process DLL host.exe. Does anybody know what DLL host.exe is? What's DLL host.exe?
Running DLLs.
Yeah, it's the preprocessor for DLLs. So you run a DLL, and this is what connects your EXEs to your DLLs, right? So what they did is they put in a debugger for DLL host.exe. So literally anything you do in Windows is going to cause the debugger to run, but it's not really a debugger. What was happening was they had a VB script that was attached to that debugger. So every time you would do anything in Windows, it would launch the VB script. The VB script would activate a Cobalt Strike DLL in a process, and then basically they would have remote access to the machine. Yeah.
Does the IFEO, when it launches that debugger, is it launched at the user level or at the system level, or?
It's at the user level. Yeah. And another one I wanted to add, this was a pretty interesting one. This is kind of an exotic method. Anybody familiar with Light Neutron or the Turla APT group? This is a pretty recent one, and I added this recently because it was just, I found it very exotic, but this was one of those most recent Exchange vulnerabilities. You know, we've been dealing with all those Exchange vulnerabilities as of late. This one, basically what they would do is they would install what they call the light neuron transport agent. If you're familiar with how Exchange works, your transport agents are what moves your email around, right? So they installed this vulnerable or this malicious transport agent, and essentially what they would do is once it was installed, if they would email the vulnerable Exchange server, what they would do is they'd have these specially crafted PDF files, and what would happen was that light neuron transport agent would basically read that specially crafted PDF file, and they were able to actually execute commands against this system. Wow. So it was really interesting. So what would happen is they could do all kinds of different things. They could interact with the email on the server, but they could also execute actual commands, and this was a form of persistence for the Turla group when they were basically launching this campaign. So this is where you can get some very, very exotic forms of persistence, where you're using a specific vulnerability to take advantage of persistence, essentially. Now, to get through all this, and I know this is all crazy, and you're like, oh, I hate Windows, I'm going to go back to Ubuntu today. There are ways to get through this. Now, again, I'm not crapping on EDR tools. They're all great. I know CrowdStrike's here. They're all good, and I recommend them absolutely. But there's other ways we can add on to make things a little bit more safe. For example, there's a tool from sysinternals called autoruns. Anybody ever use autoruns?
Yeah.
Ooh, that was creepy. Is that it? Are you telling me to leave? So I gotta go now?
You're good, Peter.
So autoruns, sysinternals tool. So as you know, sysinternals is part of Microsoft now. And what autoruns does is it basically gives us a view of essentially everything on the machine, from your registry entries to your scheduled tasks, a whole bunch of things. It's very light. It doesn't need to be installed. It's a singular application. And it gives you really cool things like this. So what it basically is telling you is it's giving you a list of all your auto runs through all the various parts of the registry where this could exist. And the great thing is you can see the image path right away. So you can export this to Excel, you can do all kinds of really cool things to get a view of everything. Because if you have to go through, now I didn't show you everything in the registry, but if you have to go through individually each key and start to look through things, you'd be here forever. So by using something like auto runs, you're able to do that. Now the really cool thing as well is it actually looks up sites like VirusTotal. So it does take some of this information and it basically looks to VirusTotal to see if anything basically comes out as noticeable, and it does score it against the different antivirus tools that it's looking for. So AutoRun's a really good tool, free. You can install it, download it, use it. Like I said, it was good enough that Microsoft bought it. So RegShot is another one. Anybody familiar with RegShot? This is one that's, so when I teach malware analysis, I show this to a lot of my students, and they're like, where did this come from? It's like this little program that nobody knows about. So what RegShot does, and we use this typically when we're doing malware analysis or reverse engineering or do any kind of incident response. So what you do is you run RegShot. It doesn't need to be installed. It's a little program that runs on its own. You install it on the machine you think is been compromised. And essentially what you do is you take a shot, and it scans the machine, and it takes a listing of a whole bunch of things, okay? And then what you do is you then execute your malware in this system, and then you run another shot, and then it compares the two together. And it kind of it looks kind of like this. So it creates a lot of stuff. So even if you're not in the malware game and you're just curious what happens when you run a program in Windows, run RegShot, do a shot, run your program, and then run RegShot again. The amount of footprint on Windows is insane. Like the amount of times that it goes and it adds keys or it searches your registry, it's insane the amount of stuff it does. So you can see here, what it's telling me is it's telling me the amount of keys that were deleted, the amount of keys that were added, and the ones that were modified. So RegShot's really good at telling you like what's being changed on your machine when a particular exe is being loaded. So very, very good tool to have. And again, it is free. You can download this and use it to your heart's content. And then my favorite in this whole thing is good old Sysmon. So if you're not using Sysmon, I feel like Mark Rusinovich owes me like royalties on this, because I go and I actually do presentations and workshops on Sysmon itself. This is one of the best security tools I've ever used. And if you can not install anything on your Windows machine except one tool, Sysmon is it. Okay, so how many times have you gone in the registry? Does anybody know what event ID 4688 is? Come on, you all know what 4688 is, right? Nobody? New process being created? Yeah? So this is the crappy thing about the registry, right? It has a lot of really useful information that nobody understands. And that's when it's giving you anything of any value to begin with. So what Sysmon does is it essentially installs on your Windows machine. It's very lightweight, and basically uses the process monitoring foundation, which Windows is using today, and it can track file, network access, anything. Like the newer versions now, when you go to a website, it'll actually track the DNS request in your log files. It tracks everything to the point where it does the most basic thing. When you launch a new program and you see that 4688, and you're like, oh, okay, great, launch a program. Well, when I look at the subsequent event in Sysmon, which is an event 1, it has its own numbering, okay? It creates its own log file in your event monitor, so it doesn't overwrite any of your event logs. It actually takes a hash of the program that was actually run when I ran that program. So because I have that hash, and if I find out that hash is bad, if I'm running Sysmon on all my machines in my enterprise, I can go to something like Splunk, and I could search all of my logs for that hash, and I know where that malware has been. It's like, why aren't they doing that with Microsoft? I don't know. But we can find some really cool things with this. If you look at it, There's a couple of events like event 11, which is your file create event, event 12, which is your registry event, or object create and delete in the registry. Event 13, registry event value being set in the registry, and registry event key and value renaming. Those events right there, basically it's everything that we've been talking about. So now I have a way of actually tracking this through the event log that is native to Windows, okay? So if you look at it, for example, we have our startup file detection. So we've created malicious startup files, right? We can look for events in the startup folder. We know where the startup folders are. I showed you them. We can look for events that are occurring in that startup folder with event ID 11 or file creation that will point to a new file being created in that location, right? And then we can filter that down, and then we can basically bring that into our Splunks or whatever our SIMs are, and we can look for things that are be created in known startup folders, right? We have the registry run keys detection, so event ID 12 points to actions and modifying the registry. So we know, again, I showed you all the places where malware basically will modify the registry to maintain persistence. So we know where it's going to be. So now if we could start to monitor those keys for things that are changing, we get a bit of an idea if malware is starting to persist on our network. And we've actually used this, and we've been able to stop ransomware from spreading in environments because we detect it once, twice, 3 times, and that's where we say, okay, now it's time to stop. So we cut off the network, and then we have 3 machines infected with ransomware as opposed to 600 machines infected with ransomware, right? And the cool thing is, this is what it looks like. So it's a typical event in the event log. Event ID 13, source is sysmon, and you can see our target object, HD local machine software, Microsoft Windows current version, run, test run. We actually can pick this information up. And then basically the really cool thing is, if we're looking at the MITRE attack framework, and if we can bring that information into our SIM, we can actually start to feed intelligence into this. So we can actually start to look for behavior. So you see how this is increasing again? We now have behavior through MITRE attack that we know that there's specific things that are going to happen in specific places. If we link the two together, the data coming in from our machines and the MITRE attack threat intelligence, and we look at that in our SIM, we can start to put 2 and 2 together, right? We can look for startup file creation. So things like .command files, .ps1s, .bat files being created in specific startup directories, okay? And then what sysmon does that the event log doesn't do as well is it allows us to really pare down what we're going to get. So if we start to bring all this stuff into a SIM, for example, it's going to be a lot of data. But what sysmon has done is they actually allow you to do conditions. You can actually create conditions in the configuration of sysmon. So in this case, I don't want to look at everything being created. I just want to find anything in the start menu directory, the startup directory, and it has to end with bat or command. And if it's something else, I don't care about it, don't log it. But if it has that, I want you to log it. So you can do all of that. And the really cool thing about sysmon is that configuration file, you can load it live. So what we've done is we've had configuration files that we use for breach response on a USB stick. I'll go in and I'll load that right up, and then it sets my machine to log breach response type details that I need. And you can do that in real time. You don't have to reboot, don't have to do any of that. So you can see we have a target file name, users Amy Walsh, app data roaming, Microsoft Windows, start menu program, startup, shell.command. So again, because I told it I wanted to see anything with a .cmd file in that startup directory, it logged it for me, right? So in closing, I think we're right on time. From a tools perspective, collect the persistence mechanisms using single commands for specific techniques or tools for collection of a bunch of them at the same time. Don't rely on any single tool for answers. Like I showed you auto runs, I showed you sysmon, I showed you a bunch of other tools. It's always good to use a number of tools when you're trying to do the analysis to see persistence, so that you make sure that one tool is not misreporting information. Analyze the command, file hash, file signer, and file path information to enrich the information. and more information for external services. There's all kinds of really good threat intel out there. MITRE is a good one that has some really good stuff. The whole techniques area of persistence, all that MITRE is information on behavior they pulled off from real world campaigns. So using that stuff is a great way to enrich the information you have. If the output doesn't help, check the information against other clients in your infrastructure. It's essentially found on other hosts too. And look for anomalies. An exe in the file startup folder where normally link files should be replaced, or look for IP address or web requests and scheduled tasks. Again, looking at the way that Windows works and looking at the outliers of why would it be doing that? Why would a scheduled task be going out to a server in North Korea? You know, why would an exe be in a place where a link file would be? So starting to look at anomalies of why things are there. In a lot of cases, as I showed you, the attacker is basically turning Windows upside down to do things that it's not really supposed to do. And with that, I open it to questions. Anybody have any questions? You look all fatigued and tired.
PowerPoint.
Excited.
You guys are going to have the slides, right?
I think so. We'll validate that.
If you don't, email me. Look, I work for a consulting firm. I'm not a sales guy. I'm not going to pitch you. If you guys have questions, come out and ask me questions. You know, that's why I have my personal email there. Don't worry. I always do this. I come in like, well, we don't want to call him because he's going to try to pitch us. I'm not a salesperson. If you guys have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. And you don't have to worry about there being any kind of sales pitch. So thank you. And thanks to